Hello everyone, I am Kenshin. Welcome to Talking About History. When talking about US President Richard Nixon, the first thing that comes to mind is the Watergate incident and his political cunning. However, not many friends may know that he was unexpectedly friendly to Native Americans. Before the show starts, please subscribe, share, and turn on the little bell. This will help us grow faster. Without further ado, the show begins. Forget what you thought you knew about Richard Nixon. Sure, he's infamous for his diplomatic dance with China and that little Watergate hiccup. But did you know he's also got some serious street cred when it comes to Native American rights? That's right. Old Tricky Dick actually did some good in his time at the White House. Let's rewind a bit. Picture America's track record with native tribes. It's not exactly a highlight reel of justice and fair play. For centuries, the federal government's policies were more like a wrecking ball, smashing tribal sovereignty and tearing apart communities. But then along came Nixon, swooping in like a hero in a cowboy movie. He wasn't content with just being remembered for shaking hands with Chairman Mao. He wanted to leave a lasting legacy of support for native people. And boy, did he deliver. Nixon wasn't just talk. He put his pen where his mouth was, signing over 50 legislative acts aimed at boosting native sovereignty. That's more than any other president before him, folks. And it wasn't just empty promises. Nixon backed it up with action. First up, he gave back sacred lands to tribes, the biggest return of its kind, and even threw in a generous payout. Then he shook up the Bureau of Indian Affairs by appointing Louis Bruce, a Mohawk powerhouse, as commissioner and doubling the agency's budget. Talk about putting your money where your mouth is. But Nixon's real game changer, ending that nasty termination policy that was tearing tribes apart. Instead, he championed self-determination, handing the reins back to native communities to govern themselves. It was like a breath of fresh air in a room full of smoke and mirrors. So, next time you think of Nixon, don't just think Watergate, think of the guy who stood up for native rights when it really counted. Tricky Dick may have had his flaws, but on this front, he was a real trailblazer. Nixon's Indian mentor. You ever wonder what lit a fire under Nixon's tail when it came to Native American rights, despite his infamous White House tapes? Well, it all traces back to his college days at Whittier, where he met a real game changer, Wallace Newman, a football coach and member of the Louisiana tribe. Now, Nixon wasn't exactly the star quarterback. He spent more time on the bench than on the field. But Coach Newman, he saw something special in that scrappy, 150-pound kid and pushed him to never back down. Nixon himself admitted in his memoirs that he learned more from Newman than almost anyone else in his life, aside from dear old dad. But here's the kicker: Nixon wasn't just inspired by Newman's coaching prowess. He was downright enamored. His right-hand man, John Ehrlichman, spilled the beans about Nixon's admiration for his old coach. They used to joke about it behind closed doors, but deep down, Nixon had a real soft spot for Chief Newman. And it wasn't just talk. Newman was more than just a coach to Nixon. He was a friend, a mentor, and later on, a fellow warrior in the battle for native rights. Now, Nixon wasn't one to wear his heart on his sleeve, but beneath that tough exterior beat the heart of an underdog sympathizer. Case in point, a little-known late-night rendezvous in May 1970, when Nixon slipped out of the White House with his trusty valet, Manolo, to have a heart-to-heart with war protesters at the Lincoln Memorial. They talked about a lot of things, but Nixon kept coming back to one thing: the plight of people of color. He lamented the mistreatment of Native Americans, acknowledging that what America did to them was just as bad as what was done to African Americans. And you know what? He was determined to make it right. As Indians got loud, Nixon tried to listen. Nixon's time in the Oval Office coincided with a wave of Native American activism that was gaining steam across the nation. But here's the kicker: instead of cracking down with an iron fist, Nixon took a different approach. He played it cool, giving these fiery protesters the space they needed to air their grievances. Take the Alcatraz Island saga, for instance. In 1969, A group calling themselves Indians of all tribes decided to make a bold statement by taking over the iconic island in San Francisco Bay. And you know what Nixon did? He didn't send in the troops or unleash the police dogs. He sent negotiators to sit down and chat. Sure, talks eventually fizzled out, and the last of the occupiers were quietly removed. But Nixon made it clear that he was willing to listen. Then there was the Trail of Broken Treaties, a nationwide caravan organized by the American Indian Movement, AIM, in 1972. Picture this: hundreds of protesters from all walks of tribal life descending on Washington, D.C., armed with a laundry list of demands. And Nixon, he didn't slam the door in their faces. He let them in, eager to hear what they had to say. When tensions flared and the situation turned into a week-long occupation, Nixon stayed cool as a cucumber, insisting on negotiations and even sending his advisor to smooth things over. But Nixon's open-door policy faced its biggest test in 1973, during the infamous Wounded Knee standoff in South Dakota. This was ground zero for Native American pain, the site of a brutal massacre back in 1890. Negotiations hit a snag, shots were fired, and things got hairy. But Nixon wasn't about to let it spiral out of control. He rolled up his sleeves and got to work, brokering a deal with AIM leaders to investigate the grievances and diffuse the tension. Sure, Nixon's approach wasn't perfect, and it wasn't always smooth sailing. But when push came to shove, he knew that sometimes, listening was the best way to move forward. And hey, maybe that's a lesson we could all stand to learn from old Tricky Dick, first president to give back native land. It's like the tide was finally turning after centuries of injustice. In 1970, Nixon made history by signing a bill that handed back the sacred Blue Lake in New Mexico to the Taos Pueblo community. Imagine that after over 200 years of land grabs, this was the first time a slice of stolen land was rightfully returned. But Nixon wasn't stopping there. Oh no, he was just getting started. 2 years later, he whipped out his presidential pen once again and issued an executive order giving Mount Adams in Washington back to the Yakama tribe. It was unprecedented, setting the stage for even bigger moves to come. And boy, did he deliver. Nixon dropped a bombshell with the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, a game-changer that handed over a whopping 45.5 million acres of land back to Alaska Native people. And get this, they even got a fat check for $962.5 million to sweeten the deal. It was a historic moment, a giant leap forward in the fight for native rights. Nixon supported native education and self-rule. Nixon may have left the White House under a cloud of scandal, but his legacy in Native American affairs is one worth remembering. Let's talk about the Indian Education Act of 1972, a game-changer that brought scholarships and funding to schools on nearly 300 reservations. And that's not all. Just 3 years later, another major education bill sailed through Congress, paving the way for even more progress. But Nixon's crowning achievement, his Indian self-determination policy. He wasn't just talking the talk, he was walking the walk, advocating fiercely to scrap the disastrous termination policy that had wreaked havoc on tribal nations for far too long. In a fiery speech to Congress in 1970, Nixon laid out his vision for a new era where native futures were shaped by native hands, not dictated by federal bureaucrats. It was a rallying cry for independence, for sovereignty, for a fresh start after centuries of broken promises. And even after Nixon bid adieu to the Oval Office, his legacy lived on. President Gerald Ford picked up the torch and signed into law Nixon's Indian Self-Determination and Education Assistance Act of 1975. This landmark legislation cemented the federal policy of Indian self-government, setting the stage for a new chapter in U.S.-Indian relations. Sure, Nixon's presidency may have ended in disgrace, but on many Indian reservations, he's remembered as a hero. His impassioned push for native sovereignty earned him respect and admiration in communities across the nation. What do you think about this story? Please leave your comments. See you in the next episode.